Well, it finally happened. A highly discerning art dealer commissioned a piece from me. Well, my aunt asked me to build her a cutting board, but still a fun project. Hope you enjoy it. To start out, we headed over to Clark's Hardwood Lumber in Houston, Texas, to get some pieces of hard maple. The final board was supposed to be at least 2 feet by 18 inches, 24 by 18, so we needed to get some larger pieces. I wanted the final board to be an end-grain cutting board that was roughly 1¼ to 1½ inch thick. I started by measuring out roughly 2-foot sections and cutting them into the pieces I needed. My 20-year-old Delta miter saw stressed out a little bit, but still cut its way through the thick hard maple. After checking again to make sure I had enough wood, I started running it through the planer, running all 4 pieces at a time to make sure the boards would all be the same width and would be smooth on the front and the back. Because this was a rough cut piece of wood, the 2 sides were not straight. I used the blue tape and CA glue method and taped a straight edge onto each piece of wood. I then ran the straight edge along the table saw to make sure I had at least one 90-degree angle. After I had one straight side, I then cleaned up the other side of each of the boards. This made sure that each board would be square so that when I cut it up and flipped it, it would glue together well. After all the boards were squared up, I then ran it through again, cutting each board into multiple random widths. This will provide better pattern whenever we glue them all together. I did a final cleanup on each of the edges just to make sure that they were square so that when we do our final glue up, they would all fit together nicely with no gaps. I then laid out the pieces in the order that I wanted them to be glued. Once you glue it up, we're going to cut out the cross sections and flip them, and that's what will create the grain pattern for the final end grain cutting board. I put some tape down and used 4 clamps and lots of elbow grease and lots of glue to make sure that the board was fully and solidly glued up. "24 hours later, I removed the clamps and the tape and the sacrificial end boards. I then used my drum sander to clean up the glue. Note, this is the speed of the drum sander. Very slow. Let's speed this up a little bit to save you some time. My drum sander is currently set up with 80 grit sandpaper. As you can see, this still leaves a pretty rough side even once it's cleaned up and all the glue has been sanded off. I didn't worry too much about it because once we make the cross-section cuts and glue it up, a little bit of rough edge will just leave room for glue to seep in and make for a stronger hold. So slow. Once the drum sander was done, it was time to square up one of the edges. I put the board back on the table saw and cleaned up one of the edges to where it was 90 degrees. The reason this needs to be square is because we're about to cut the cross sections, which need to be exactly square for the glue ups. I set my table saw at roughly a 1 1/3 inch width. Once you start cutting these widths out, you'll rotate them over, and that will give you the final width of your cutting board. When I made my first cut, you'll see that there was some fairly significant burning of the wood. This could be due to a number of reasons. One, the saw blade I had may not have been sharpened properly. Two, it may not have gone in smoothly, and therefore it may have pinched the wood. Or three, my little table saw just wasn't up for cutting almost 2-inch thick hard maple. I think probably it was more user error. So here you see all the top grain laid out. Because we wanted an end grain cutting board, all we had to do was flip them over to the end grain. And then what I did is I rotated every other one so that we could get some variety in the look and create what I think is a neat pattern. You'll notice there's still a little bit of burning on some of the cuts, but once we get done with the final sanding, those will go away. Here's the glue up, the beast as we call her. Lots and lots and lots of glue. I did my best to line up the edges because the closer they were to 90 degrees, the less material we would waste when we did our final cleanups. After the glue was done drying, back to the drum sander, that super fast sander of wood. You can hear the sarcasm dripping. Because my drum sander was set to 80 grit, as I mentioned earlier, and because we want a final cutting board to be roughly 180 to 240 grit, I got my Bosch orbital, random orbital, so that I could get it much more clean before we went to the final oiling stage. I worked my way up the grits from 80 to 120 to 180. Just a note here, patience is a virtue, and unfortunately not something that I possess a lot of yet. As I was going through, rather than using my random orbital sander, I decided I wanted to accelerate things a little bit. So I pulled out a belt sander and put an 80 grit belt sander onto the board. The problem with that is this is an end grain cutting board. So whenever you see and take a close look at it, you'll see a lot of random squiggly lines on it that were created because the belt sander pulled the ends of the grains down as it sanded it and created a random pattern. I'll show you how I fixed that in a little bit. When I got to 120 and 180 grit, I water popped the board just to make sure that it was fully smooth. This is where you spray water on the board, very lightly, not too much, just to get the grains to stand out a little bit. That way when you do your final sanding, and when the board is used with wet materials, it'll still be very smooth. Once finished sanding, I squared the edges again using my table saw. Little bit of hand sanding on the edges just to make sure they were really smooth. This is a great shot to show what the belt sander did to the end grain. With my router, I added a beveled edge all around the top 4 edges and the bottom 4 edges. Although I had hoped sanding it down and going through the progression would have eliminated some of the belt sander marks, it did not. So what I decided to do was to rerun it through my drum belt sander and see if I could eliminate some of the up and down markings. As you can see, it eliminated a lot of them, but I had to start over through the sanding process. Back to the random orbital sander, back through the 80, 120, 180 grains, and water popping. The final step, once all sanded, was to give it a nice oil bath. Here we go. I really love how the patterns ended up on this. Although very simple and all the same color, using the end grain and flipping it and alternating it and cutting it into various widths really gave it a nice look. I think my aunt's really going to enjoy it. Well, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.